So the epic conclusion to the Fear Street trilogy is finally here. Will they be able to follow up the previous two fun films and give us a satisfying conclusion? I mean, I'm sure they will. How many horror franchises have gone bad by the third entry? Fear Street Part 3, 1666 is brought to us by director Lee Yaniak and stars Kiana Madura, Benjamin Flores Jr., and Ashley Zuckerman. Fear Street Part 3 picks up right where Part 2 left off. In other words, in 1666. Now, real quick, I'm going to try and keep this review as spoiler-free as possible. And while I feel as if I will be successful in doing that with this film, there may be some light spoilers for the previous two films in the series. So if you haven't seen those and you just want zero spoilers whatsoever, go watch those and then come back and watch this. But I'll do my best not to spoil anything at all for the whole series if possible. In this one, we get to see the origin story of Sarah Fear, the titular witch in the series. We get to see what led her character to becoming a witch and her eventual cursing of the land. But what we also get is the conclusion to the overarching story that's been going through this entire trilogy. So I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say that we do eventually go back to 1994 where the story first began. So we can get the closure of the characters that have followed us throughout this entire trilogy. Now, speaking of those characters, or more specifically the actors who portray those characters, they're all here. While we did get some returning characters and some actors from the first film to the second, in this one we get pretty much everybody who was in those two films, but they're in different roles for the most part. Most of the characters in 1666 are played by the performers that played parts in Part 1 and Part 2. And I thought this was pretty neat because some of these people are supposed to be the ancestors of the characters from the first two films. So it makes sense that coming from the same bloodline, they do share some common physical attributes. And by common physical attributes, I mean in this movie they look exactly the same as those characters, but you know, it's okay, we get it. It was actually kind of fun to see some of the performers that didn't make it to the end credits of the first two films back in this one. And I also thought it was kind of neat that some of these characters that are played by the same actors from previous films are kind of acting like their characters did then, but in a 1666 setting. It was a nice little callback here or there to the characters that we had in the previous film. Now, unlike the previous two movies, the characters are what keep us invested in the first part of this film. Sure, they were good in the other ones as well, but it was really the setting and the nostalgia that really drew us in the first halves of those movies. This one, it's 1666. I don't know many people that have nostalgia for 1666, seeing as how it was like 300 and something years ago. So instead, they've got all these characters, or at least the performers that played characters that we were familiar with, turning back up in similar characters. And that was fun to see. Some of these characters that we liked from the previous one showing up here again. Now, this one did take a little bit longer for me to get into compared to the other two, and that does probably have something to do with the fact that it doesn't have that nostalgia factor. However, much like the other two, once it does start going, it does get really interesting. This one, more than the other two, does really focus on the story and trying to tie things up, explain everything to you so you know what's going on. This is where we get all the answers, and that is the main draw of this film. The actual origins of Sarah Fear aren't really all that surprising. There are a good bit of times in this movie, especially in the first half, where the movie is trying to keep something secret and have a reveal, a big surprise for you, but you already figured it out. I mean, it's not the end of the world, it was still fun, but that did take away from it a bit. Now, another thing about this movie is that it, unlike the other two, can't really stand on its own. The second one, even though it does feed off the first film a bit, could still stand on its own for the most part. But this one, not so much. It very much depends on you having seen the first two films. Which makes sense, it's the third and it's the conclusion of the trilogy. I'm not gonna hold that against it, but just know that going in. If you ain't seen the first two, you need to watch those before you see this one. Now, even with that, all that aside, I feel like they did give us some really good reasons as to why this stuff happened. They had a really good setup here. The whole Salem witch trials-esque setup thing has never been my thing, so I wasn't really as interested in that whole backdrop. But the characters and the things that are happening to them and the implications of this movie and what happens later on in his story, I was very invested in. Now, the first half of the movie was more or less enjoyable, but it's the second half of the movie when things really pop off. I'm not gonna go into any details about what happens in the second half of the movie because that would just totally ruin the experience, but that is absolutely the best part of this film. Now, they do recycle a few things from the previous films, but that doesn't take away from the fun factor. And honestly, the things that they recycle worked in the other films, so it makes sense as to why they would do them here as well. The movie did have an overall satisfying ending as well. The big thing that happens at the end of the movie, I do wish was just a smidge bigger, but overall, I am happy with what they gave me. Now, Fear Street 3 has the smallest body count out of all three films by a long shot. We do get some blood, some brutality, and some violence, but nowhere near as much as the other one. In fact, the vast majority of the really gruesome violence that we get in this film is flashbacks to the previous two films. But it works here. It makes sense as to why in the first half of the film we don't have a huge body count. There's some nasty, icky stuff that happens here and there, but as far as body counts go, it's fairly low. Well, kinda. There is a part that technically, I guess the movie does have a high body count, but you don't really see any of it happen, so I kinda don't count that. There's also an epic brawl that happens a bit closer to the end of the film that I won't ruin for you. And while it is cool, I do wish we got a bit more of that. That seemed like a really cool setup, and what we got was really neat. But my imagination ran wild, and I think it could have been so much more. As it stands though, as with the very end of the film, it's okay. I enjoyed what they gave me, I just wish there was just a smidge more. Overall, this one was much more concerned with expanding the lore and getting us to the finish line, and not so much with the nostalgia. But given that it does have characters that we've come to like and enjoy, that got us through those parts that the nostalgia usually did. And as a whole, I did enjoy the story and execution of Fear Street Part 3. This was, much like its predecessors, just a really fun movie, especially the second half of the film. It does kinda sorta break its own rules at times, has some convenient conveniences, and there's some choices that they make that me, myself personally, I wouldn't have made. But overall, it was an enjoyable time and a satisfying conclusion to this trilogy. Guys, at the end of the day, Fear Street Part 3 1666 was, much like its predecessors, a really good time. The first half, while necessary and did give us some critical information, wasn't quite as infectious as the previous two, but it was still a fun ride that provided us with characters that we've come to like, including some that we've already lost. The body count is lower, but the intensity is just as high as it ever was. We get an overall satisfying conclusion to the trilogy, and honestly, that's not something we always get with these types of films. While it might not rise quite to the level of the first film, it is still absolutely worth a rent.
All he wanted was this.
To return some videotape.
I did really enjoy this movie. Now, it does have a slow start, and that is much more noticeable this time around because the nostalgia is not there. But once it gets going, this is a really enjoyable film and a very satisfying conclusion to this great trilogy. So if you're looking for a fun horror trip for the night, then check out all three Fear Street movies, and I think you'll have a really good time with how this all turned out. So there it is, guys, my review of Fear Street Part 3 1666. If you enjoyed and want more content like this, hit that subscribe button and help my little channel grow. If you want to help out the channel, check out my Patreon in the description below and become a jarhead and get some of the awesome benefits to go along with that, like these guys. If you liked what I had to say, give me a like. If not, let me know in the comments below why. And as always, stay sexy, Sunnyvale.
Forever.
So after watching the first two films, you know that Sarah Fier at some point in time lost her hand. And we figure out why and see how and when that happened in this film. And I gotta say, holy shit, that is probably the moment in the whole film that really made me make this face. And just kind of hold it for a little while. Like I was just there just like... Because this scene, while it's not the most gruesome scene in all the movies for sure, it just had a special something to it. The way they shot it, the way it went down was just really kind of fucking hell. Damn! I mean, the whole situation about how she lost her hand was really sudden, visceral, and brutal. I mean, damn! That sucks. She did shake it off fairly quick and take it like a champ though, so hey, good on you, Sarah. Better than me, because I'd be crying like a little bitch for the rest of the movie.